are joined today on the International Classroom podcast with Lord Jim Knight. Thank you ever so much for coming and taking the time to speak with us today. Whereabouts in the world do we find you?
Alex, I am in my office here in the House of Lords, right in the middle of the Palace of Westminster, which is in dire need of redecoration, which I've been promised in 2025.
Well, that in itself has to be one of the best introductions I think I've had on the podcast so far to date. But there may be people out there who maybe don't know, haven't come across the work that you have been doing. How would you like to introduce yourself to the listeners and to the viewers today?
Well, thanks. Look, I've had a career in politics for a long time. I've been mayor of my town. I've been a member of parliament. I've been a government minister. I'm now in the upper house of the UK Parliament in the House of Lords. But beyond politics, I've had a passion for education for 20 years or so, and coupled with technology. And so what I now do is a range of different things around international schools, around education technology, around supporting schools wherever they are in my country and around the world to try and do the best they can for young people wherever they are, so that we can unlock their talents and create a better future for all of us.
That's fantastic. What has been, I'm interested to start with really kind of what led you and interested you in getting into education?
Well, that came about really thanks to Tony Blair, who was Prime Minister at the time. Yeah, obviously I'd been interested in education. I'd been to school. I've got children who are in school. I'd been governor of a secondary school. But I was, at the time, the Minister in the Environment Department, DEFRA, so Minister for all things bright and beautiful, if you like. And I got a call from Tony. He said, look, you're doing a great job at DEFRA, but I want to move you. I want you to be Minister for Schools. And I accepted the offer and really loved doing that job for 3 years. And it sort of captured me. It's that sense, I suppose, that it's a profoundly human business education. So despite my interest in technology, the humanity of it means that there's a huge diversity of different people who are working and learning, and which means that there's not a silver bullet. There's not an easy answer. We can't just say, oh, we'll do that and everything will be fine, because everyone's different and people require different ways of doing things and different approaches. And so we're always learning, and that's just profoundly interesting.
And obviously, you've got that, as you say, the background, you've got politics, got this interest in technology, and you bring these together with education. Like, how do you think those fields have influenced each other in shaping your perspective on education?
Well, that's changed over the years. You know, when Tony rang me that day, it was before the iPhone had been invented. Facebook was up and running for about a year or so at that point. You know, we've seen a massive amount of change in that time. So then, education and schools in particular was a really important political issue. You know, it was Tony Blair's education, you know, in those days. But that was about, you know, and it still remains about helping particularly the most disadvantaged get some qualifications, get to university, get an apprenticeship, get a decent job. And technology was just a tool. Now, all of that remains true, but what technology has done through that really rapid change that we've seen in that 20-year period is it's massively changed the labour market. And so jobs are being invented now that we haven't got a hope of educating people for, but the rules of the game are changing, I think. And so, you know, the opportunity of using technology to help us teach and learn better, to help us assess children in a more interesting and dynamic way, to record people's achievements differently than certificates for qualifications, and then give them a future in a world of generative AI, of knowledge in many ways feeling devalued, but critical thinking and the ability to create, the ability to think across subject silos, that's become even more valuable than it's ever been. And most importantly, machines are now starting to outcompete humans, and our competitive advantage is to be better humans, because those machines will never out-human us. And so, to an extent, the challenge of schooling has now become a little bit more around how we nurture better humanity alongside the basics of English, maths, digital skills, oral skills, and so on. And the subjects are also important, but I just think technology has now changed the game, and that the politics is yet to catch up with that, because parents still want their kids to get a place in a good university or a great apprenticeship. But I think parents are starting to realise that the mental health problems that children are having, the return on investment of going to university diminishing slightly as the cost goes up and as graduate unemployment goes up. It's still a good deal, but it's less of a good deal than it was in my day. And so these things are changing, and I think parents' views are changing, and therefore the politics is changing.
I think if you were to wrap up everything you've just kind of described there, and obviously really what we want to talk about today, it's very clear and evident why you're so interested and passionate about STEM. And obviously, like you said, with the technology, the English, the maths, and the idea that we want to bring, instead of having siloed subjects, about interdisciplinary, about how we can bring those things together. Yeah. And it really is, in some ways, a real fantastic opportunity and something that's super, super exciting, even for me as a scientist. But obviously, at the same time, it's the how. And we're going to explore that as we go through this conversation today. We've got some exciting things we want to talk about. And it's all in line with the STEM learning project that's going to be, the conference that's going to be taking place within Dubai in the end of February, which I believe you're also going to be attending as well.
I am. I'm looking forward to it. I'll work out something interesting to say by the time I get there.
Well, let's kind of focus on some of the areas that we've got for this, because obviously we talked about education, about obviously the purpose of it and how we can make it applicable for all, and obviously the lower, let's say, I'm trying to think of the right word, how I would describe it now, but the less fortunate, the people who don't have access to some of these things, like we really want to focus on the societal resilience. Yeah. And so from a STEM perspective, I think it has the power to tackle some of the most pressing global issues, doesn't it? So how do you think STEM and STEM learning goes about preparing educators first and foremost to teach about these topics that are really important for all students? So things like sustainability and resilience in a way that drives real world impact.
Yeah, look, STEM learning is first and foremost about teacher professional development and helping teachers refresh their subject knowledge, acquire new subject knowledge, acquire the skills in the lab to bring the theory to life through practicals and through making stuff and doing stuff. But we're also about engaging employers. We've got 30,000 STEM ambassadors who are working as adults but are wanting to help excite children about science. So there's an engagement with students themselves around the excitement of science, but the core business is how do we help teachers be as confident as they can be in their subject knowledge. And so when you then look at these big global societal challenges, and I think that's led by climate change, because with my politician's hat on, when I think about what the big issues that we're facing, migration, conflict, food shortage, water shortage, almost all of those go back to climate change. And if we're still seeing around the world, in this country, too many young people leaving school without the confidence to understand how climate change works, what causes it, and how they can mitigate it in their own lives, in their family life, in their community life. And that's just a crime. We have to get that right. Now, we can get that right. We have in the science curriculum here in the UK the core basis of the science behind climate change, and that's replicated in the geography curriculum also. So at STEM Learning, that's something that we are passionate about, and we're wanting to help science and teachers, and we'll engage with geography teachers too, around teaching them all about how how that works and the story of climate change. I've just finished a book, and you might come back to books later, but by Jeremy Paxman, the political journalist, called Black Gold, and that's all about the place of coal in our history here in Britain, and how all energy comes from the sun, and in the case of coal and oil, rainforests capture that energy through photosynthesis, and then through compression it becomes coal, becomes oil, and then that becomes a great source of energy to burn really hot, but create huge amounts of pollution. So Britain's history, and I love to be able to connect across silos. We wouldn't have had the British Empire, we wouldn't have had our military power if it wasn't for coal, if it wasn't for that energy caught by photosynthesis and compressed through geology. But we also wouldn't have had climate change. We have burnt all those fossil fuels through the last 200 or 300 years, and Britain has led the way on that. And now we are paying the price. Now, you can then have a philosophical argument about whether it's a good price to pay, but we kind of got to help people understand the air quality issues, the pollution issues, the greenhouse effect, all of the elements around sustainability and climate change, so that we can then change our habits.
Yeah, and we really realise it or not, then, like you said, about across silos, great history lesson. So you have history you can bring into that, and then we talk interdisciplinary. So there's relevance to all of it, like you say. And you kind of mentioned as well with the political hat on, like what role does public policy play then in supporting STEM education to align with these global sustainability goals?
It has a really important role, and I tried to change the law here a couple of years ago to introduce a new aim to our national curriculum, which was to instill an ethos and an ability to care for oneself, to care for others, and to care for the natural environment for present and future generations. And that was about trying to ensure that when we're doing curriculum design, when we're doing inspection and accountability, one of the things we're holding schools to account for is that ability for young people to be better humans, and as part of being a better human, a better custodian of the environment for the next generation too. And I wasn't successful, but I am passionate about the importance of policymakers doing this. Now, we currently in the UK have a curriculum and assessment review led by Becky Francis. I would anticipate and hope that one of the things that comes out of that is that we will embed teaching about sustainability and climate change much more squarely in the curriculum. Because when we talk to young people, as Teach the Future have done, which is an organisation run by the young people, they passionately want better climate and sustainability education. When they've also polled teachers, they want to have more curriculum time, more timetable time to be able to teach it too. So this is a no-brainer. This is something that we can and should do, but policy needs to drive it, because currently policy is incentivising other things, not teaching climate change and sustainability.
And are you finding, because obviously we're talking here about the UK side of things, but we want to think about it from a global side now. How are you seeing that, let's say, other governments and other institutes globally are trying to tackle these issues?
Well, Italy led the way. They introduced a new sustainable citizenship subject that every school-age child in Italy has to study for an hour a week. And Mexico, New Zealand, one or two others have followed in their wake, and that's something that I think we here in England can do. And I think there's a strategic importance to what Britain decides to do, what the International Baccalaureate decides to do. Those jurisdictions whose qualifications are then exported around the world and used, with people like Cambridge and AQA, Pearson, they're selling British A-levels, IGCSEs around the world, the IB, to some extent the American and Australian systems too. And they help show the rest of the world what best practice looks like. And if we can get those changes in those jurisdictions, then I think the rest of the world will follow.
Yeah, from experience as someone who is international and sort of following, let's say, EdExcel and IGCSEs and GCSEs and A levels, yeah, I think the UK curriculum is still seen as, the one of the top, if not at the top of that. So the fact if we can embed those things into it and the skills into it, then it becomes a huge driving force for this change. And one of the things that again is important here is the skills, because it's all good and well reading about something, it's all good and well having this information there in front or watching a video of it, but from a science perspective, we know that sometimes you just can't beat hands-on experience. And I had this conversation with Alex Moore again about STEM learning, about the role of hands-on learning. From your side of things, when we've got students and teachers who now are probably going one side of technology and really focusing on screens and using screens, why do you think, and what would be your selling pitch to teachers to go, hey, you know what, we need them off the screens. We want to maintain and really drive the skills, the tactile hands-on STEM learning. What would you be saying to those educators?
Well, I would say, I'm sure you're a brilliant teacher. I'm sure there's a lot you can do in the abstract, and the virtual world is wonderful, and there's a certain amount that we can do, but there is nothing to beat the full sensory experience, the tactile experience, the smell and the sound of the whiz-bang of science, of the joy of growing something in your own classroom that is capturing carbon, to be able to show what it's doing to the water, to the air quality in your classroom through the course of the day, because you're starting to grow things or you're starting to ventilate, you're changing the nature of the environment. There are things that, the penny can drop much more easily for young people if they can see and feel and taste and smell it, than if it's just something that they're engaging in a much more solitary way through their screens. Screens are great, but they supplement the real world. They don't replace it.
And focusing then on obviously STEM learning, who we're really focusing on with this part and collaborating with, how have you seen their experimentation and maker spaces affect teachers, especially from a professional development perspective? What are the educators saying who are doing this and using these programs?
They're getting huge value out of it. There's plenty now who, and especially those that trained during COVID, who don't really have the competence in practical terms. They did too much of their learning theoretically and online themselves when they were training and when they were learning, and so the confidence that they can get of coming to York if they're in the UK, but coming to a centre to be able to learn how to do these things practically, how to use the maker spaces, how to lead with confidence in those spaces, so that you're then instilling the curiosity in young people that's at the heart of great science, is just keeping asking the questions. Why does it work like that? What's my best guess? How do I test whether that best guess is right? All of the basis of the scientific method, that's all done through practical and engineering and technology in those maker spaces too, and being able to produce things, to design things. That really excites young people, but we have to have teachers who are confident to do it. And too many have been rooted in this somewhat more abstract, more theoretical approach, and they just haven't quite got the confidence, and we can really help with that.
Yeah, and that's the part we want to explore, is how do we help? So what would be your sort of top 3 ways if we're saying, look, we want you to get hands-on? And I know we're sort of saying science here, but let's go, we don't have to be a scientist. You could be someone who's interested in interdisciplinary work, about moving between English or maths or art or any of these things. What would be your recommendations on how they should get started and go about doing this?
Well, I'm a fan of project-based work. The idea that you can be assessed by exhibiting things, you can make stuff, you can create new things and show people the thinking behind it. Now, we don't always have time in the timetable and the curriculum for that, but particularly in the early years of secondary, there is often time to be able to do some of that. And that can start to unlock how teachers might go about that. And there's plenty of resources on the STEM Learning website to help people think about all of this, and find some really good examples. And one of the things that happens when we bring STEM ambassadors, when we bring employers into the classroom too, is that it locks the theory into practice. You can see how this then also works in the real world. And sometimes some of those employers have got problems that they've been grappling with, and they, by engaging with young people and starting to explain things and talk about them, it can also help them unlock some of their own thinking, because they're going back to basics. They're going back to thinking and arguing things through, and then they start to see, oh, yeah, actually, I can see through this conversation with young people, and the mirror that they reflect back on my work, there are new ways for us to be able to answer some of these problems that I've been grappling with for ages. There's a really exciting synergy that we're able to pull off.
Yeah, and really just to reiterate with it as well, like the skill sets that we're talking about are actually probably applicable to numerous, if not, well, probably all of the subjects in the curriculum as well. Like we automatically had a conversation about history.
Yeah.
In terms of the background of this, and we talk about geography, and even in languages, because again, people might be listening and watching this going, oh, well, I teach MFL, this has nothing to do with me. Whereas the reality is it's the skill sets that we're probably more concerned about. And it isn't just England and speaking English that have these problems. It could be in French or in Spanish or in Arabic.
And
so
I saw this fascinating article this weekend about a very small tribe in the Amazon where they've discovered they don't have words for numbers. And so their language deals in quantities of things and is capable of describing quite exact quantities of things without numbers. And what that piece of scientific research that's been done into this tribe is telling us is the relationship between numerology and cognition might not be as direct as we thought it was, because there are workarounds that those languages that don't have numbers are using, and that doesn't mean that they're innumerate. And it was a sort of fascinating, mind-blowing idea that there are these people successfully operating highly sustainably without maths, without numbers, and that was very challenging. It's very interesting.
Wow, there's a lesson there, right there. But that's the thing, isn't it? Because again, it just goes back to creativity, and that's the hard part for us. And we stifle this because we kind of think if we want our students to be creative, we need educators to be creative. And this kind of boils down to that risk, as we've said, of the over-reliance on technology. How do we go about finding the balance then, the balance between being digital and physical?
I think, well, like everything, I like the idea, the concept of digital obesity. Like everything, we have to have things in balance, and there is a healthy diet of using these tools to help us be more curious, to find answers quickly, to connect with different people. All of that is great. But at the same time, if we're thinking about creating a culture of thinking, cultures of thinking require us to also reflect, to stop, to daydream a little, to immerse ourselves sometimes in books and the imagination, to wonder. And there is a joy in just wondering about stuff, which is really hard when you're using these devices, because they're pinging at you all the time. There's a torrent, a tsunami of content coming at you, and you haven't got time, space, or anything to be able to wonder. Yeah. And that's at the heart of it. A few years ago, I was talking to a Nobel Prize-winning chemist who chaired the Royal Society in the UK, and he was based in Cambridge. And I said, well, all of my talk about education reform doesn't really mean much to you, does it? Because you're in Cambridge, you've got access to all of these great minds and these deep thinkers within subjects. And he said, but deep thinkers within subjects are not necessarily what I need. If I'm going to develop the next Nobel Prize-winning piece of science, I need people who can think across subjects as well as think deeply within them. And so when he's putting a research team together, he wants people who can be creative in their thinking by thinking across silos, by just wondering and being curious and finding wonder.
It's the research that was done ages ago about convergent and divergent thinkers.
Yeah.
And I remember my PGC teacher when I was at university was a physicist, and he was saying to us how David Beckham was a much better physicist than he was. And we're going back when I did it, 2005.
Right. Okay.
And he was like, and we were just stood there because we were academics, and we were like, whatever. And he goes, David Beckham can bend and curve a ball and place it wherever he wants to be with the right force, the right velocity. And he said, that is like how you manipulate physics. And he's like, he's a much better physicist than I'll be. And we were just blown away by the approach of that, because it was the divergent, like you'd never think of a footballer as a physicist.
Yeah.
And it removed the idea of the convergent, that, if you're IQ, if you want to be smart, it's IQ and it's English, science and maths. Whereas I think there was studies, it must have been one of the books, I can't remember whether it was like a Malcolm Gladwell book or something, or it might have been Predictably Irrational, but it was something to do with the 20 Nobel Prize chemistry Nobel Prize winners from American universities. And people just assume that they would have all gone to Harvard or to Yale or to MIT. But actually, in the research, it showed that, well, they probably of 25 winners, went to 20 different universities. Yeah. Because it wasn't just the convergent, hey, I've got a good knowledge about this. It was, I can problem solve and I'm resilient and I can be creative. All these things that we associate with divergent thinking skills. Yeah. And I think what you've just said there is absolutely hits the nail on the head in terms of what we need and the curiosity and the wonderment. And that kind of leads us nicely into then what we're thinking about the future. And in terms of, we've mentioned already about the jobs of the future, how do we go about future-proofing education then to make sure that, the cutting-edge technology, the cutting-edge STEM fields that we want educators to know about and to be preparing students for now, how do we go about bridging that gap in our curriculum to make sure we're future-ready?
Yeah, look, I think there are some basics that we should never let go of. I think it is really important that people are orally confident, that they are literate, that they are numerate, that they are capable in terms of the digital world, with data and creating content as well as consuming content and so on. So, there are some things that are standard as skills as much as knowledge. You then overlay on that, I think it's important that we do have a foundational framework of knowledge, so that, particularly with all the fake news, the misinformation, the disinformation that's flying around online, that young people can make sense of it in whatever the learning is that they're doing. And within that basic foundation, we should be instead of teaching lots of little bits of content, and I think too many teachers I speak to are overwhelmed by the amount of content that sits in the curriculum. We should free up from all of that content and teach the big ideas. What are the big ideas of science that might cut across from physics to chemistry and biology and computer science? But there are some big ideas there. When I talk to the Institute of Physics, they're frustrated that physics teachers don't have time for the big ideas because they're too busy teaching what the examiners want them to teach, rather than what it takes to really excite people. And then on the next layer on top of that is to start to get kids, young people, to want to really explore their learning. So they've got all of that foundational knowledge, they've got core skills. So then, how can they start to find what they're passionate about, find their interests, and explore their learning, which, largely, I hope, will be in the STEM subjects, but bring in the humanities and the arts too, because we know so much of the future and future employment and future prosperity of the world is going to be linked into those STEM subjects. But get them designing things, get them making things. I went to one of the best schools, best is a difficult word, one of the most privileged schools in the world in Switzerland recently. Their makers space was just fabulous. And seeing what young people were making there through resistor materials, but embedding technology, solving problems, finding problems that we're facing in their lives, in their communities, in the world, and making things to solve them. Now, not all of them are perfect, but they're curious, they're excited, and to an extent, it goes back to that project-based learning. The extended project qualification is one of the biggest predictors that we know about at the moment of future success in university. And so, the EPQ does quite a lot of that. It builds on the foundations of knowledge that people and skills that people have, and then allows them to explore new learning. And that's really where I'd like to go, because then, when they leave school, they'll be confident, self-directed learners. They'll know where to look for research, for new knowledge, for new skills. And then as the dynamic labour market keeps shifting because of AI, because of quantum, because of all the new things that are coming or have arrived, they'll be able to keep up. And they'll be able to keep shifting and keep pivoting their careers because they've had that fundamental experience of being good self-directed learners who can create new knowledge and skills for themselves.
Now, I'm going to put my political hat on with this because there's something you mentioned there. And I'm one of those educators who is frustrated by the content. And for as much as I love the UK curriculum, how it's laid out and what I can do with it, I'm also stifled and my hands are tied because of the exam board, because of what I'm forced to have to teach. And these are companies that make millions of pounds in terms of selling these examinations. Like, if we're talking about all these things and we're wanting these things, and then there's enough educators wanting these things, I suppose it's a difficult question to ask, but do you think exam boards are going to change? Do you think the exam boards are going to listen to what educators want and maybe what some politicians like yourself want and actually make that change?
Yes. Often when I speak to them, they're frustrated that the regulator won't let them change the way they might want to. They're not perfect. We talked about climate change earlier. I'm critical of the amount of questions in those summative exams, the public exams that people take. There have been about climate change. It's as if that bit's too controversial in the curriculum, so we won't ask about it because there are some parts of the world where politicians try and deny that climate change exists. So we'll just pretend it doesn't exist just because it's safer for us. That's not an answer. So exam boards aren't perfect, but one of the roles I have is a regulatory one on the qualification committee at Pearson. I can see they do the big academic exams, but they do big vocational exams. They do the whole range. They can shift as and when policy and regulation requires them to. And the same will be true for Cambridge. The same will be true for AQA. For all of the big exam boards. They are up for this. They're ready for the change. They just want the lead to be taken by the politicians in the end.
Yeah, and it's great to have that information because you hear, again, teachers, we're the worst for this, by the way, but just this rhetoric, aren't we, in terms of we want this, and then it's like, it's the exam boards that are holding us back. But actually, to hear that and go, well, actually, maybe not. Maybe some of the people we know on exam boards, they do want this as well, and they see the benefit of this, and maybe their hands are tied. So have that information is reassuring for me as an educator, and hopefully lots of other people listening, that there is light at the end of the tunnel for this. There is change that is coming, and change that's desired. So that's good to know. So thank you for sharing that. And it's more, continue on this future thought. You're very excited. And you mentioned one thing as well about sort of quantum. We talk about AI a lot, don't we? Quantum computing. That's just one thing. And I know you're so well versed and exposed to all this, but of all these radical possibilities that are out there, I'm just curious, what's exciting you at this moment in time?
I think, without necessarily being an expert in it, I think quantum is really interesting. The Willow chip that Google announced last month being so much faster than the fastest supercomputer that we currently have, to a multiple that's more noughts than I can describe, is mind-blowing in terms of what that means, what that could achieve in terms of helping us answer some of the big problems that the world faces now. Any of these technologies can be used for bad as well as for good. And there's again, with my public policy hat on, there's a need for us to come up with some good regulatory guardrails around them so that they ensure that they're used for societal good rather than just for profit, probably at the expense of humanity. So, we've got to be careful, but crikey, the power of that and what that could do, and indeed, I hope what it can do without using quite as much energy as AI is having to use, which is, I think, a real problem. The energy consumption of the big data centers. If the single chip is able to do what lots of other chips are currently having to do, that's exciting in terms of the sustainability of technology too.
Yeah, I think because you often read these and there was a slightly irony in it in terms of using AI to solve sustainability problems that we may have. And yet the amount of energy required to power the AI, that double-edged. So to have something like that is very, very exciting in terms of the future. Very, very exciting. As we start to draw this to a close, then we've got a quick fire round for you. Just 3 questions to get some insight there. And we kind of mentioned one, but we'll see if you maybe think of one for this. But a book or resource that you would recommend for educators who are interested in STEM?
Well, look, I mentioned the Black Gold book by Jeremy Paxton just because I've just read it. But in the end, I just direct people back to the STEM learning resource that we have. There's lots there on the website to help teachers. We've got a huge raft of resources that can help people across the STEM subjects. So start there, and then you'll then be able to sort of riff through and find all sorts of other content, which would be really helpful.
Great piece of advice. Who has been the most inspiring figure in your career and why?
Well, the person I think we should celebrate a lot more, and therefore I will choose, is Sir Johnny Ive. So here's a guy who, his dad was a design and technology teacher, indeed a design and technology Ofsted inspector in Essex. And so part of his Christmas treat was to go to Dad's work to the school and be able to go to the D&T workshop and muck about and do stuff. He goes to study industrial design at Newcastle Poly, and then he becomes the person who designs the iPhone, the iMac, the Apple MacBooks. He was Steve Jobs' designer, and he changed the world. And he's a modest guy. He doesn't like the attention, but God, what he's achieved with that background, just rooted in design and technology, is just immense, and the creativity, and I think we should all be really proud of him as one of the Brits who's made the biggest impact in the last 20 years.
Maybe he could just come and help freshen up your room a little bit as well.
Yeah.
That one in there. And what is then one STEM innovation that you wish existed when you were in school?
Well, in the end, I have to go with the smartphone, which is controversial because there's lots of people wanting to ban them in schools. And I've got some sympathy with certainly banning social media for children. But the ability, as a tool to help me nurture my curiosity, I think is just extraordinary. And I would love to have had that, to be able to just look things up, find out stuff, just surf my way through a whole bunch of knowledge. Would have been really exciting to me as a child.
It would have been fantastic. I mean, yesterday I was driving around with my youngest daughter. She's 9. And for whatever reason in Dubai, there was clouds. It was one of those days. And we were talking about it. And she said, Dad, did you know clouds can weigh like 500,000 kilograms? And I was like, really? And she's like, yeah. She said, so how do they float then? I was like, it's a really good question, darling. I said, and my phone's plugged into the car. I said, and for me being me, I said, let's ask ChatGPT. And she went, no, because she said ChatGPT can lie sometimes. And I was like, this is my 9-year-old. And I was like, fair enough. Anyway, we did the voice talk with it. And I think it struggled to recognize her kind of international accent versus with my accent. And she got really annoyed with it. But just the ability to have that conversation or look things up and find, and her, and I went, do you understand this now? Do you understand why clouds? And she's like, yeah. She goes, I still don't like ChatGPT. I was like, okay. And I was like, well, there's hope for us. If my 9-year-old who, is saying is like, it lies to us, it's not always right. I was like, yeah, I'm pretty happy with that.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. Sounds like she's got her head screwed on and asking the right questions. But this weekend I had to. We had big storms in the UK, and we'd spent Christmas and New Year up in Orkney, which is at the very north of Britain, in an island off the north coast. And we decided we were going to have to drive back to London in a day and keep ahead of the storm. So we were on our phones watching this impact of these cold winds that had come down from the north, trapped in high pressure, and then this low pressure coming in from the south with warm, wet air suddenly hitting and creating the snow that was then going to bombard us, and watching those weather systems move on our phones while we tried to race ahead of it. And we just about got home in time after a 16-hour door-to-door journey.
Oh, wow. Wow. That's how long it takes me to get from Dubai back home, basically. And speaking of which, as we said earlier, you will be here with the STEM Learning crew in February. What can we expect, obviously, from yourself and the guys that are going to be here, for those people listening and watching and maybe learning about this conference for the first time? What can they expect?
I think, look, they can expect to obviously learn more about what we're doing at STEM Learning, reconnect, I hope, with their training and the importance of training with other people, being able to open new doors in their professional practice, and in doing so, open whole futures to the young people that they serve. We're really keen to help in Dubai and the UAE and the Middle East more widely, with that huge pool of educators that are there, and to be able to help them be able to unlock, through this very dynamic time that we're living in, as we've been talking about, Alex.
Amazing. It's very exciting, and people listening and watching, we will leave the information in the description below so they can go on and get themselves tickets and learn more about it. And as we wrap this up, obviously, I am tremendously grateful for you giving over this time today, obviously in a very busy day in the House of Lords, the way you are. What is one message that you would like to leave the listeners with about the future of STEM education?
I think I would say STEM is right at the heart of our future. Science, technology, engineering, and maths, that is the future. It doesn't exist in isolation. The humanities and the arts are also critical for us being better humans. But if we want the better future that we all crave for ourselves, for our children, for our grandchildren, then lean into STEM, and STEM being taught on its feet, not just in an abstract form through screens and books, but let's roll our sleeves up, get stuck in, and create a better future through STEM. Amazing point to finish with. Jim, thank you ever so much for joining me on the International Classroom.
Thanks, Alex. It's been amazing, and we look forward to seeing you in Dubai very soon.